Today on The Why and the Buy, we've got Marylou Tyler with us.
Predictable prospecting really gets us to think about, it's all about the prospect. It's not about you.
Yes. So Jeff, Marylou has a very impressive background. She is a sales process improvement expert, and she is founder of Strategic Pipeline, where she helps companies like Apple, Bose, and UPS grow their revenue by increasing their sales pipelines. She has 2 books under her name. One is Predictable Revenue, which is actually already sold over 60,000 copies. And Predictable Prospecting is her newest book. And she's here to talk to us a little bit more about how to create a predictable prospecting pipeline.
Awesome. Let's get to it. Hi, Christie.
Hi, Jeff.
We're recording now.
The many hours of conversation you and I have had, we've had probably half of them that haven't been recorded.
You know what we should do? We should start a podcast.
You think? Let's call it The Why and the Buy.
All right. And welcome back to the Why and the Buy podcast. I am Jeff Bajorek, as always, and I'm here with my partner in crime, Christie Walters. How are you today, Christie?
I'm doing great, Jeff. How are you?
I'm doing awesome. So there is a bunch of great stuff that is happening. Haskins has a new EP out. It's amazing. Those guys get better.
It sounds great.
Every single time. And really just look forward every time to hearing stuff from them. And we get to call them our house band. And maybe that's because my cousin's a guitar player. Maybe it's because they really like us. I don't really know if it matters. But they keep putting out good stuff. So you should check them out at haskinsmusic.com. The other thing that I want to kind of talk about here really quickly before we get into that interview, which was very, very good, by the way, is a charitable event for a foundation or an organization called Chosen Vision that provides opportunities for adults with developmental disabilities that they would otherwise not get. It's a really, really special organization. I'm not going to belabor the point here because I want to get to that interview, but please go to the show notes, or you can go to chosenvision.org. It's spelled exactly the way you think it is. Or you can email me, jb@jeffbajorek.com, and I'll get you all the information to it. We got a really cool fundraiser coming up. I'm going to play a lot of golf and try to raise a lot of money and really help this great, great cause. So, Christie, you want to get on with this interview?
Yes, let's do it.
So you were working in the business before you were working in sales. You have that technical background?
Yes, I am an engineer by trade. Mm-hmm. I used to work on operating system software design and development. And so I was behind the scenes, like throw the pizza under the door and I'm happy kind of person. So very much an introvert, very much in the background. But I had the gift of being able to talk to clients and translate what they needed to the programming team. So I just was always put in this client-facing role, pushing and kicking, and I just didn't like it, but I finally one day, because of my boss, had no choice to get into sales. So
don't you love those bosses that push us out of our comfort zone, right?
Yes. Or in my case, waved a magic wand over my head and said, "You are now a salesperson." Goodbye. I
kind of had something similar like that happen to me.
And so did I. I mean, the reluctant salesperson. But I think that's, there's a lot of people like that. And I think that's one of the things that, I don't know, there's something to be said about being reluctantly involved in something and then turning out to be really good at it. But I think what we'll find is that there are more people who are reluctant and don't need to be reluctant, because there's a lot of people who would be better at selling if they only had a good idea of what selling was. And that's one of the things I try to do and try to evangelize, if you will, is that, if you've made a friend, you've made a sale. And that it's all just about relationships, right? I mean, you've got to be able to communicate and present value and make people think differently. But we all have this vision or these ideas of what selling is really like, and that's just not the case. And I wish we could get rid of that stereotype.
Well, unfortunately for me, I had the stereotype because the people that I replaced were the Rolex watches, the expensive suits, the beautiful cars that you couldn't go down a driveway without the front end hitting because it was so low.
Yeah.
So the Ferraris. And
I have one of those driveways. Not one of those cars, though.
they were my salespeople. They were the people that I supported. So it was a very stressful and scary time selling in a disruptive environment to go from an engineer to a salesperson when I saw the role model of what they had.
Right.
Very scary. And I thought, there is no way. I don't even know how to dress right.
So, okay. So can we talk a little bit about that? You're here to talk about your book, and I want to do that. But I think it's a really good point for both Christie's and my audience to be able to demonstrate that you came from a world where you spoke the language, and that was your. I mean, is it fair to say that was your best weapon when it came to selling? Is that you had the technical knowledge to be able to dig in deep with the people that you were actually helping, rather than just selling some solution that was intangible.
I had two things going for me. One was what you said, is that I was more consultative in nature because I'm a problem solver. When you're coding, you're trying to do the 5 whys, root cause analysis. It's in my DNA to get, even my kids can't stand it because I'm always like drilling down on the why, they hate that. But I had that going for me. But more importantly, I had process. So everything was like this one big puzzle of which I needed to solve components of that. So my ego was in my pocket the whole time. I wasn't really getting stressed about finessing the words, finessing the language. I was letting the data tell me how to proceed. So there was a comfort for me in that the data really guided me as to where I should be having conversations, with whom I should be having conversations, and what type of conversation I should have.
That's fascinating. It's interesting. I didn't have a chance to finish the book, but I did get started and I read through several things. And like most salespeople, I flipped all the way to the back to the quick guide.
Well, of course, that's why it's there.
You know your audience, right? I think that is amazing. So what I love about the book, and what's different from some of the other books that we've talked about on this podcast, is that it is process driven. You can sense your background in the way that the book is written. And it's so different and such a departure from what we've seen with other sales books and other prospecting books, that it makes you stand up and take notice. I think then I know that's just in your DNA, but it was ingenious in how you guys positioned the book. And I didn't read Predictable Revenue, but I think I would assume that kind of follows the same process.
Yeah, it's very similar. And predictable prospecting really was the next generation of predictable revenue, because I've been working just at that part of the pipeline, from cold conversations to a qualified opportunity, going on 30 years now. So I've focused just in that small little area, and predictable prospecting is really where predictable revenue got stuck. The people who tried predictable revenue in the 5-step process would get stuck in certain places. So predictable prospecting is actually a 28-step process that's shrunk down into 10 chapters. And because I saw where my clients were just like getting stuck, I mean, it was a sell the dream portion of the framework, which is your value proposition, which is why change, why now, why you. That messaging, that conviction wasn't really there. But we didn't teach how to do that in predictable revenue. And I tried to do that in predictable prospecting.
Why do you think we get so stuck? Why is prospecting so hard?
I think it's because we are really focused on advancing the sale on our time, as opposed to being empathetic with our person, the belly to belly, who we're across from, either virtually, on the phone, where they are in their head. And so predictable prospecting really gets us to think about, it's all about the prospect. It's not about you.
That's such, I've written about that. I have lived that. That is it's something that is so counterintuitive to salespeople, because most salespeople, they're up against a deadline, they're up against the month end, they're up against the quarter end, they're up against the year end. And, ultimately, and it was just fun. It was a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to a very, very good friend of mine who was my mentor in sales. And he said, Jeff, it's not my decision. Yeah. I said, well, I was just trying to ask him to distill down what it was that, made him different, especially in the medical device sales
Oh, right.
environment that
Yeah.
we came from. I mean, and he
Right.
sold for a very, very large company that everyone here has heard of, and it was
Mm-hmm.
a very high pressure kind of organization. But he
Yeah.
stood out in that way. And what was interesting is when he left that organization, he actually became more. I don't want to say customers. Well, I mean, customer centric is the right word, but it was less about him and more about, look, it's their decision. I've given them all I can. I'm going to stay around. I'm going to keep reminding them that I'm here in a non-pushy kind of way. But look,
Yeah.
ultimately, they're going to make the decision on their own time, and I get bonus points for not making it about me. And now that's my
Right.
differentiator. I don't know if that's as much of a differentiator anymore, but it's really the way that people do things now, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, the what our goal is and what our role is to create a predictable process so that we have enough of these conversations in the hopper at various stages of conversation so that we don't experience that deep dive of valley and then the peak. We want it to be an even keel. And to do that, we need to leverage technology. We need to leverage the conversations that we can offload to technology as much as we can, but still be meaningful and know where people are relative to their level of awareness and also their buying behavior. And the technology allows us to do that now. So there's no excuse.
What's your favorite tool, let's say for a small business?
Mm-hmm.
Small businesses, they get up, maybe they're startups, maybe it's a mom and pop, maybe it's a side hustle, maybe it's a side hustle that someone wants to be a main hustle one day. They want to leave their career and do their own thing.
Yeah.
What is your favorite tool for helping them manage those highs and lows? Because all boats rise with the tide, and the bigger the tide is, the higher the boats rise, right? So if you have
Mm-hmm.
more people in that funnel, so to speak, then
Yeah.
those ups and downs kind of get a little smoother. But what's your favorite tool to use for that?
Well, I think, if you're doing outreach where you're really taking cold records and you're trying to start that first conversation, that's a different tool than if you have someone who you're doing a follow-up conversation where they opt in, they raise their hand to us to some extent saying they're interested in talking with you. So those two channels have very different tools. But what I like is a tool that allows you to queue up conversation, then allows you to A/B split test those conversations to see what bubbles up to the top in terms of the themes of pain that people are going through or the goals they're trying to reach. So any tool that allows you to queue up those conversations so that you can have touches, a number of touches on a regular interval are the tools that I like. So the marketing automation tools would be for inbound where they're opting in. And then they have some outbound tools, outreach tools that are used for cold conversations, for those conversations where we have an email address, but we haven't gotten them to opt into our marketing automation system in order to start that conversation.
Where is the balance between social media and email marketing? How do you see social media playing into this?
I think social media is gaining in its popularity and its effectiveness. But, like we talked about in predictable revenue, it's not necessarily a predictable channel. So it counts, but you can't rely on it for consistency right now. I use LinkedIn. I have really seen my LinkedIn connections grow every time I do a post, for example. It's crazy how many people, but the conversion of that to actual business, email is still winning for me. It's still the way for me to target that person, that reader. And like you said earlier in the broadcast, gosh, you know your people. I do. I have 3 different archetypes. So I have 3 different people that I talk to. So depending on who I'm talking to, I have them in different email streams.
That's awesome. So Marylou, I know you take several different companies through this, both the predictable revenue and then subsequently the predictable prospecting process. Let's say that fast 5 times.
I know, PPD.
How difficult is it for people to wrap their heads around the idea of a buyer persona? I've watched people just struggle with this indefinitely. So how do you get them past that?
I added a new wrinkle to it because I don't like it to be called buyer persona. I like it to be called prospect persona because the call to action of a buyer persona is to get someone to raise a hand. The call to action for a prospect persona is a first meeting, some type of conversation where we're doing an are we a fit? We're actually trying to qualify them. So they are two separate profiles. We do leverage the work that's done if you're in a company that has marketing of the buyer persona, but we add a whole new layer, which is discussed in chapter 3 of the book, of adding to that persona because we utilize a sequence in order to begin conversation, which includes the phone. So the phone is not even really talked about in a buyer persona, but for prospect personas, it's talked about a lot because we're still using the phone to map through the organization. And there's a bullseye in chapter 3 that talks about the actual target person. The next ring out is the direct influencers, those people who have that prospect's ear. And then the ring out from that are the people that can give us a warm referral. Why? Because we're trying to get in the door to have that first meeting.
That's interesting. Do people struggle with wrapping their head around that concept?
You know, my students, I just taught a class on this, so I think they get more stuck on the SWOT 6 than they do on the personas. The SWOT 6, everybody just pushes back on it because it's hard to do, but it's your value proposition. It's why you matter in the world. The prospect personas, because it's a methodical way of going through, and we pepper in questions to be thinking about, they've been pretty successful. I've gotten some really good ones from clients and from students on the actual persona definition. And they get it because they know that the end result, the goal of filling this out is to get that first meeting, which motivates them because getting a first meeting is just one step closer to getting their quota.
Oh, it's all about that, right? I mean, it's one thing to get people to raise their hand and say they want to hear from you. It's another thing to say, I not only want to hear from you, I want to hear from you about me. And I think that's, and that's something that gets lost, right? Social media is this wonderful thing, and it's this terrible thing at the same time, but that's another podcast, right? We've got this bandied about term, social selling, that became this crutch, this excuse, people didn't need to sell anymore. They didn't need to prospect anymore because they could just put everything out there on social media and people were just going to magically come to them. And then what do you know? Next thing you know, the algorithm changes on LinkedIn, and now all of a sudden they're stressing this instead of that. Or now all of a sudden certain people are showing up in my Twitter feed and I can't see anybody else. Or Facebook just exploded with a bunch of advertisements and things. And so now where did everything that you based your business on, everything you based your prospecting on is completely changed, and you are in the creek without a paddle, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's you can't lean just on one thing, but it's just really interesting how that gets lost, that there's a difference between people who want to hear what you have to say and people who want to hear you say something directly to them.
Right.
How do you teach that difference?
Well, we talk about it in predictable revenue, actually, and we have 3 types of leads, and that's a course curriculum that we talk about as well, which is the inbound system, which is people actually engaging, filling out a form. There's the referral system, which are your clients and colleagues that, again, they're coming inbound to you. And then there's outreach. Outreach is the only one where we have control over segmentation. We have control of only going after whales. We have control of only going after those accounts that have a high probability of closing with high revenue potential. Everything else, inbound, we're going to get minnows and whales. Referrals, we're going to get great referrals, but they're few and far between. In a lot of cases, we want to build up to have a good engine of referrals. But, the one thing we can count on that we control is outreach. And if we look at outreach in a way that helps us build the inbound, helps us build the social, helps us build the referral systems, and all these channels coming in give us a breadth of lead flow that has a lot more quality in it and it drives growth because our process is more predictable.
I love that. I love the idea that it's you taking control of your sales process. That's the biggest difference, right? And you get back to Stephen Covey and the 7 habits, and rule number 1 is take control, right?
Right.
Take responsibility.
Right.
Marylou, with so many organizations separating those roles, you've got your prospectors, you've got your closers, you've got your service people. Do you think that's a good idea? Because I don't know that it is.
I think it really depends on the culture of the company, and it also depends on the sales cycle itself. Now, I have always worked in complex sales, and I was a member of the team as a prospector. So we stayed with the client for a full year, even though I was building the initial conversations and getting them through the qualified opportunity. And the actual model in predictable revenue is that type of model, a 3-hour, 15 prospecting sales process where the prospector qualifies. They have a scoping call with the first decision maker or stakeholder, and then followed by a 2-hour discovery call with the team. And that's when the AE is brought in to make a go, no-go decision. So it worked really well because I serviced 3 AEs as one business developer. It's not for everybody, though. I think it's more of really, once again, since I'm an engineer, it's all about mapping out the process, doing the planning, and that will help you decide what roles should be plopped into what areas of the pipeline.
Well, what's interesting is that in that format makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
You've got continuity between those 3 roles. There are a lot of companies now that say, okay, we need prospectors. We need business development reps. We need people to get on the phone, get on the email. We need you to make 1,000 calls a day, whatever number it is. It's typically around 100. And all you do is call. Set up the appointment. You don't have to sell anything. You just need to call. And it's like, well, okay, but now as the client, as the prospect, I'm being passed from someone who's worked their tail off to get a meeting with me, but then once I like them enough to actually get an appointment or give my time to that company, they're not even the ones I'm meeting with anymore. That just gets passed along. And then once the account executive comes in, closes, and then drives away in her Lamborghini, right? Now I'm with someone in customer service role. And it's almost like we're creating a different situation where, traditionally, they say that the sales department's at one end of the building and the marketing department's in the other end of the building, and they both think the other guy or the other gal is just at fault for why the company isn't selling more. Marketing doesn't get it. Sales has no idea, right? Well, now what it is marketing and selling are getting closer together because content is involved and there's so many more pieces to the puzzle. But then we've taken sales and we've split it into these 3 roles to try to get more done. But instead of being effective, we're worried about being efficient. And then the prospector doesn't know why the customers are really buying, right? Because the customer service portion of that is, where that is all going to be, learned. And if they aren't talking or working together in concert, then they're not going to be able to understand how to get more meetings, or, the motives get all kind of screwed up. And in an organization that gets too big too quickly and tries to segment all that stuff, then there's so many things that get dropped along the way. And then what happens when someone leaves that department or someone gets promoted and you've got all this churn? It just, to me, it creates a completely different set of problems.
Once again, it all comes down to the buyer and how they like to buy. And if you're working in a situation in a corporation or even your own business where they want to be handheld throughout, then that has to be included in your sales process because it is about the buyer. Now, the companies that I've business developed for, we had very high-end sales. They were 50 to 150,000 and up. And so there is more of a concierge type of attitude from the sales teams. So we did a pod concept that worked really well. I've had clients who've tried the pod concept and it didn't work for them, but going back to the older model of getting to qualified op with the rep, doing the handoff with a meeting with the stakeholders, and then the business developer disengages. But we also tied compensation to him on close. So it is in his best interest to see what happens with the sale, going from qualified op all the way down to close one. And I think that it's really about how do those buyers like to buy? And do they want you to stay with them or not? Or are they okay to be handed off? Some do. I mean, IT people they want to go with the techie guys. They're comfortable with that. Marketing may want the handhold all the way through. But you really have to take it on a buyer by buyer basis in your company, plus what you're selling, plus the sales cycle.
And you have to communicate too, right?
Right.
And that's the other side of it. If your prospectors aren't communicating with your closers, you're going to miss something along the way.
Yeah, and let's face it, I mean, page 42 of predictable revenue, in order to generate predictable revenue, you have to know the cold calling 2.0 funnel, which is what we talked about at top of funnel. But you also have to know about lag, and you also have to know about the actual average deal size and what happened. So you need to take it all the way to close in order to be able to generate a formula for predictable revenue. By virtue of that, the business developer will know what's happening at every stage in the funnel. The other thing too is because you mentioned before about the link to marketing now, we owe it to marketing to take every conversation and disposition that with a wrap up. I mean, that comes back from my call center days where every call had to be filed somewhere with some reason why. So I instill in my clients that everything that happens stage wise, both intra and interstage, has to be wrapped up with a disposition as to why it went out, why it went forward, or why it stayed the same if it was a meaningful conversation. All of that feeds back into marketing. Why? Because then we know how to organize our sequences. Which pain themes resonated faster up front? What, should we move stuff around like Legos? Should we move email number 6 to email number 2 because that story resonated better? How are we going to know that unless we actually wrap up calls with reason why codes?
I don't have anything to say.
And well, no, it makes complete sense. I think there are so many organizations out there that just don't slow down long enough to actually put the right process in place. They don't make that investment, and that's a shame.
We get back to stopping and thinking, right?
Yeah. In fairness, though, I came from telephony call centers. I personally had a 250-seat call center with predictive dialing. We had to have a process. If you didn't, just imagine like a conveyor belt that the leads are coming off so fast. And I always think that, I love
Lucille Ball, right? Yeah.
I mean, that's how our call center would look if we didn't file things properly. We'd have numbers going crazy. So it forced us to really focus on process. And, that's really my love of process has caused me to do the same thing in these systems that we're putting in now, these pipelines.
So cool. So what is your favorite sales book? What's the classic that you go to?
Neil Rackham's Spin Selling.
Really?
Spin Selling. I like it.
I like the implication questions because they're hard. They're hard to do. And what I love about them is that it doesn't matter if you're fresh out of college or you're a tenured rep. You're not going to master it if you have more years under your belt, but you really need to really work through, and it's all based on the buyer. So those are my favorite. And we put those in what we call a pain matrix when we're actually designing the content so that we can make sure that we're delightfully poking people and getting them to think outside the box a bit in our email engine so that we're adding value with every time we touch.
What are you reading right now?
Jeb Blunt's EQ book, because I'm interviewing him tomorrow.
Are you really? I've heard some really great interviews with him on that book. I can't wait to pick it up.
Yeah, so I've started that over the weekend. That's one of mine. And then I have a ton of books on content marketing because it's persuasive copywriting. I mean, I don't know if you can see my desk, but I've got like $1 Million Mailings. I've got all of Denny Hatch's books on advertising, Ogilvy. Mostly I relook at those books a lot because I'm trying to create a persuasive argument in that cold engine to get that first meeting. And also if we got them stuck in working progress, try to get them to disqualification, we have to be able to always add value in our emails. So I'm constantly studying persuasive copywriting.
That's so cool.
So Marylou, what 3 things would you want to leave with our listeners today? And we started this conversation really to talk about landing crucial meetings. We didn't get into that topic today, so I'm hoping maybe we can have you come back at some point and let's dive into that piece of it. Mm-hmm. But when you think about predictable prospecting, the things that we almost always all mess up when we're going through that process, what would you recommend our listeners do?
The first thing is to assess the state of union. Where are you now? So descriptively, draw your pipeline on a paper napkin. Can you even draw it? Do you even know the stages that are important for your buyer? So draw that first and then really look at where things are getting stuck for you. Are they in that first conversation, or are they in the follow-up conversation? Are you having trouble speaking your value proposition as to why people should change, why now, and why you? You have to map that out in order to know where you need to focus your efforts. And the other thing is, we can't do this with discipline. We have to rise above discipline and get it into habit. It's like, you go to sleep every night, right? You have to go to sleep every night. That's how prospecting should be. It shouldn't be like, running 5 miles every day, because when you start, you're not going to be able to do that. But eventually you get there and it becomes habit. So I really want you guys to think about drawing where you are now, being able to draw your pipeline, and then work towards discipline, moving discipline into habit, because habit trumps discipline every day.
And that is a quote.
At some point, it's got to stop being hard to do.
Yeah, exactly.
That's tremendous.
Yeah.
So we've got one question that we ask everybody. And you can answer this any way you'd like, but what is your why? Why do you do what you do?
Well, my why is very easy. I've been doing this now for getting close to 30 years. I've only worked with a few clients a quarter because I work with large clients. So my why is to reach out and share my knowledge with as many people as possible, because I think it's a valuable piece of information that will reduce our stress levels as a group, and also show you that you don't have to be the consummate sales rep in order to win business, but you have to be thorough and you have to have it as a habit in order to generate that revenue and drive growth.
Excellent. Well, I highly recommend that if you haven't seen a copy of Predictable Prospecting, that you pick one up. I really am looking forward to finishing this, because like I said, I just kind of skimmed through as we were prepping for this, and I, of course, skipped to the end. But I love the approach you take here, and I think this is going to really speak to me. I've got a couple of coaching clients that I think are going to really enjoy reading it as well. So, Marylou, how can people find you?
The easiest way is LinkedIn, because you just look up Marylou Tyler and you'll see me there. I also have a website, maryloutyler.com. And for those people who pick up the book or are curious, you can go to maryloutyler.com/swag, SWAG. And I put some teaching materials out there and some, Q&A that people have been asking me about the book. So there's a lot of good information there for you to pick up without even buying the book.
That's wonderful. So we'll definitely put that on our show notes as well. And certainly for our sales leaders, it would be great to take their teams through that Q&A process. I think there's some real wins to be had by going through that process.
Yeah, good. Because there's some work product that I did a webinar with one of the vendors, and he wanted me to put all my worksheets. So they're out there for those following along with the book, including that chapter on personas. There's a whole outline of how to do that.
I love it. Well, I'm definitely going to take a look at that.
Very good.
So with that, Marylou, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. I know the listeners of The Why and the Buy are going to be super excited. And I do hope that we can get you back to talk specifically about landing crucial meetings, because I think that's a hot topic these days. And there's some process you can help us implement there, I'm sure.
Definitely. I would love to come back and help with that.
That's awesome. So, Jeff,
what do we have next week?
It's a surprise. We have Joe Shum coming on.
Oh, cool.
So Joe is a good friend of mine, and I've actually been interviewed by Joe on his podcast. So turnabout is fair play.
Indeed.
Fantastic. Well, Christie, until next week, what do we say every week?
When you understand your why, your hows and your whats get a lot better.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for listening to us on the Why and the Buy podcast. If you like us, tell us. Send us a message at the Why and the Buy on Twitter, or leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever you got this podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Talk to you next week. How about the music on this podcast? We call them our house band, they call themselves Haskins, and they're based out of Plymouth, Michigan. If you want to hear more from them, go to haskinsmusic.com and check them out. When you came